Welcome back, history enthusiasts. I'm Philip Champion, and this is WW2 Stories. Before we begin today's episode, if you're a fan of World War II stories, would you please follow our show on whatever platform you listen to and leave a comment? We would love to hear from you. Today, we're going to witness one of the most remarkable and morally complex stories of the Holocaust. The story of a man who began the war as a Nazi Party member and war profiteer, seeking only to enrich himself from the misery of others, but who underwent a transformation so profound that he would ultimately spend his entire fortune and risk his life to save over 1,200 Jews from extermination. Picture this. It's March 13, 1943, in the Krakow ghetto in Nazi-occupied Poland. The SS and Ukrainian auxiliaries are conducting a brutal liquidation action, Nazi euphemism for mass murder. Jewish families are being dragged from their homes. Children are torn from their parents' arms. The elderly and sick are shot in the streets where they stand. Thousands are being herded toward trains that will take them to Auschwitz-Birkenau and the gas chambers. On a hillside overlooking the ghetto, a German industrialist sits on his horse, watching the horror unfold below. Oskar Schindler has come to the ghetto many times before on business. He employs Jewish workers in his enamelware factory, cheap labor that has made him wealthy. But today is different. Today something breaks inside him as he watches the systematic murder of innocent people. He sees a little girl in a red coat wandering alone through the chaos, visible amid the black and white nightmare of violence. She disappears into a building, seeking shelter that doesn't exist. Schindler turns to his mistress, who sits beside him. "Beyond this day," he says quietly, his voice shaking, "no thinking person could fail to see what would happen." This moment, whether it happened exactly as later depicted or not, represents the transformation of Oskar Schindler from opportunistic businessman into something far more complex. A rescuer who would use every tool at his disposal: bribery, deception, manipulation, charm, and eventually his entire fortune, to save lives in the midst of genocide. This is the story of Oskar Schindler, not a saint, not even conventionally moral by peacetime standards, but a man who found within himself the capacity for extraordinary courage and compassion when confronted with extraordinary evil. It's a story of moral complexity, of how a flawed human being can still do heroic things, of how the capacity for good exists even in those we might least expect. It's the story of how one person armed with nothing but determination and cunning could stand against the machinery of the Holocaust and win. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to save more than 1,000 lives that would otherwise have been lost. Before we witness Schindler's transformation, before we see how he turned his factory into an island of survival in an ocean of death, we need to understand who Oskar Schindler was before the war and what brought him to Krakow in 1939. The opportunist arrives. Oskar Schindler was born on April 28, 1908 in Zwickau, a small town in the Sudetenland, the German-speaking region of what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, later Czechoslovakia. He grew up in a middle-class Catholic family. His father, Hans Schindler, owned a farm machinery business. Oskar was charming, athletic, good-looking, and utterly undisciplined. Oskar was always the life of the party, recalled one childhood friend. He had this magnetism about him. People wanted to be around him, but he was also unreliable, a schemer, always looking for shortcuts and easy money. Schindler's early adult life was a series of failures and false starts. He married Emily Pelzel in 1928, a marriage that would be marked by his constant infidelities and financial irresponsibility. He failed in several business ventures. He drank heavily, gambled, and lived beyond his means. By the mid-1930s, he was bankrupt and his marriage was crumbling, though Emily stayed with him. When Nazi Germany annexed the Sudetenland in 1938, Schindler saw opportunity. He joined the Nazi Party, not out of ideological commitment, but because party membership opened doors and provided business advantages. He also began working for the Abwehr, German military intelligence, spying on the Czech government and railways. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Schindler followed the Wehrmacht into Krakow, Poland's ancient capital, seeking his fortune. Krakow in late 1939 was a city in upheaval. The Germans had conquered Poland in a brutal campaign and were establishing occupation policies that would eventually culminate in genocide. For opportunistic Germans like Schindler, occupied Poland represented a chance to get rich. Jewish property was being confiscated. Jewish businesses were being Aryanized, transferred to German ownership for nominal sums, and Jewish labor was being exploited at starvation wages. Schindler presented himself as a successful businessman and used his Abwehr connections to make contacts with Wehrmacht procurement officers. He had money, some from his wife's family, some borrowed, some possibly provided by the Abwehr. He cut an impressive figure, over 6 feet tall, impeccably dressed, always ready with a drink or a cigarette or a joke, the kind of man who could walk into any room and own it within minutes. In November 1939, Schindler learned about a bankrupt enamelware factory called Brinnlitz. The factory's Jewish owner had been forced to abandon it. Schindler saw potential, not because he knew anything about making enamelware, but because he knew the military would need metal goods for the war effort, and a factory with government contracts could be enormously profitable. He acquired the factory through a trustee arrangement. The Nazi system made it impossible for Jews to own businesses but allowed Germans to take them over. Schindler renamed it Deutsche Enamelwarenfabrik, German Enamelware Factory, or Emalia for short. He moved quickly to secure contracts with the Wehrmacht for field kitchenware, pots, pans, mess kits. But Schindler had a problem. He needed workers, and most Polish workers had been conscripted for labor or were hostile to German enterprises. Jewish workers, however, were available. Indeed, the Nazi authorities were eager to extract labor from Jews before eventually murdering them. At first, it was purely business, recalled Itzhak Stern, who would become Schindler's accountant and closest Jewish associate. Schindler hired Jews because we cost less than Polish workers. The Nazis had decreed that Jews would work for minimal wages, essentially slave labor. For Schindler, the businessman, we represented profit. In early 1940, Schindler hired Stern, a Jewish accountant who had worked for a soap company, to help manage Amalia's finances. Stern was 52 years old, educated, dignified, and deeply religious. He and Schindler could not have been more different. Stern was everything Schindler was not: disciplined, ethical, sober, faithful. Yet they would form a partnership that would save more than 1,000 lives. I recognized immediately what Schindler was, Stern said later. He was a bon vivant, a womanizer, someone who liked the good life. But I also saw something else, a man who, despite his flaws, was capable of being reasoned with, who could be influenced toward good. So I began to work on him. Stern started subtly. When Schindler needed workers, Stern would recommend people, but not just any people. He recommended intellectuals, teachers, rabbis, professionals who were in particular danger because the Nazis were systematically murdering the Polish and Jewish intelligentsia. He recommended people who were disabled or elderly, or otherwise vulnerable. And Schindler, focused on his business and enjoying his newfound wealth, approved the hires without paying too much attention. Stern was creating a refuge without Schindler fully understanding what he was doing, observed one historian. He was filling the factory with people who needed protection, and Schindler, distracted by his parties and his profits, wasn't really noticing. Not yet. By mid-1940, Amalia employed about 300 workers, nearly all Jewish. The factory was profitable. Schindler was living well. He had an apartment in a requisitioned Jewish home, a German mistress, and enough money to entertain Wehrmacht officers and SS officials lavishly. He threw parties that became legendary, with black market liquor flowing freely and beautiful women available for the German elite. These parties served a purpose. They made Schindler popular with the authorities, created relationships he could exploit, and established him as someone important, someone connected, someone not to be bothered with petty regulations. Schindler was a war profiteer, using slave labor to enrich himself while the people whose labor he exploited faced systematic persecution and murder. There was nothing noble about his initial motivation. He was getting rich off Jewish suffering, and he enjoyed every minute of it. But something was about to change. Schindler was about to witness something that would transform him from exploiter into rescuer, from profiteer into protector. He was about to confront the reality of what the Nazi regime he had joined was actually doing. Witnessing evil. The Krakow ghetto was established in March 1941. The Nazis forced the city's 20,000 Jews and thousands more from surrounding areas into a walled section of the Podgorz district. The ghetto covered only about 600 acres, meaning families were packed into apartments with multiple families per room. Conditions were deliberately made intolerable. Inadequate food, poor sanitation, overcrowding, constant arbitrary violence by SS and police. Jews were required to work for German enterprises but lived in the ghetto under curfew and travel restrictions. Each day, workers would march from the ghetto to their workplaces under guard, then march back at night. Schindler's Jewish workers were part of this daily routine. Initially, Schindler viewed the ghetto as an abstraction, something that didn't really concern him. His workers showed up at the factory each day, did their jobs, and went back to the ghetto. What happened there wasn't his problem. He had parties to attend, contracts to fulfill, profits to count. But as 1941 and 1942 progressed, reports filtered back to Schindler about conditions in the ghetto. Workers arrived bearing marks of beatings. People disappeared, arrested, deported to labor camps, shot. The Nazis implemented increasingly harsh policies, restrictions on food rations, deportations of the elderly and sick, random killings in the streets. Schindler began to pay more attention. He started visiting the ghetto ostensibly on business, but also to see for himself what was happening. What he saw disturbed him. Families living in desperate poverty, children begging for food, the casual brutality of SS guards who would beat or kill people for entertainment. I think it began to dawn on Schindler that these weren't just abstract workers. They were human beings, reflected one survivor. People with families, with children, with lives that were being systematically destroyed. And maybe somewhere in his conscience, he started to feel responsible. In the summer of 1942, the deportations began, the Nazis implementing the final solution. The genocide of European Jews started emptying the ghettos and sending their inhabitants to extermination camps. From Krakow, trains departed regularly for Belzec death camp, where Jews were murdered in gas chambers within hours of arrival. Schindler watched as the population of the ghetto shrank. Families who had lived there for generations disappeared. His workers came to the factory with haunted looks, knowing their relatives had been deported, knowing they might be next. And then came March 13th, 1943, the day of the ghetto's final liquidation. Schindler had advance warning that the liquidation was coming. His contacts in the SS, who attended his parties and accepted his bribes, told him the date. He instructed Stern and other supervisors to tell workers to stay overnight at the factory if possible on March 13th. Many did, crowding into the factory spaces, sleeping on floors, terrified but alive. But not everyone could stay. Some returned to the ghetto because family members were there. Others didn't receive the warning. And so, on March 13th, Thousands of Jews who remained in the ghetto faced the SS's brutality. Schindler, whether by design or chance, found himself on a hillside overlooking the ghetto that day. What he witnessed scarred him forever. The systematic murder of thousands of people, men, women, children, the elderly. Bodies littering the streets, blood running in the gutters, the screams and gunshots echoing across the city. He came back to the factory shaking, recalled one worker who saw him afterward. I had never seen Herr Schindler shaken by anything. He was always so confident, so in control. But that day he looked like he'd seen hell itself. That night Schindler apparently told his mistress, "They're liquidating the ghetto, I saw it, I can't get it out of my head, the shooting, the screaming. They're killing everyone." Whether this specific conversation happened as later depicted, what's certain is that March 13, 1943 was a turning point for Oskar Schindler. He could no longer pretend that what was happening to the Jews was somehow tolerable, somehow none of his concern. He had witnessed genocide with his own eyes, and he could not unsee it. After that day, Schindler changed, Itzhak Stern said later. Before, he had been primarily concerned with profits, with business, with his own pleasure. After, he became obsessed with saving people. The business became secondary, the primary goal became keeping Jews alive. The surviving Jews from the Krakow ghetto were transferred to Plaszow forced labor camp, located just outside the city. Plaszow was commanded by SS Hauptsturmführer Amon Göth. One of the most sadistic and murderous men in the Nazi system. Göth would shoot prisoners from his balcony for sport, execute people for the slightest infractions, and create an atmosphere of constant terror. Schindler's workers were now in Plaszow, no longer able to live at or near the factory. They had to be marched each day from the camp to Emalia under guard. This meant they were subject to Göth's arbitrary violence, to the brutal conditions of camp life, to the constant threat of selections where the weak or sick would be sent to Auschwitz for extermination. Schindler decided he couldn't let his workers remain in that situation. He began lobbying to establish a sub-camp at his factory, a place where his workers could live under his supervision, removed from Plaszow's daily horrors. He argued that productivity would increase, that his workers needed to be available for shifts at any hour, that having them nearby was essential for war production. The real reason, of course, was to save their lives. But Schindler had learned to speak the language of the Nazis. Everything was justified by reference to war production, to efficiency, to the needs of the Reich. And he backed up his arguments with bribes, suitcases full of black market goods, cognac, jewelry, money, delivered to Göth and other officials who controlled camp policies. Schindler understood the Nazi system perfectly, observed one historian. It was corrupt to its core. Everyone had a price. If you could afford the bribe, you could buy almost anything, including human lives. The price of life. Amon Göth was, by all accounts, a monster. He presided over Plaszow camp with absolute power, murdering prisoners on whim, torturing people for entertainment, and stealing from the possessions of those sent to their deaths. His villa overlooked the camp, and he would sit on his balcony in the morning with a rifle, shooting prisoners at random, men lining up for roll call, women walking to work assignments, anyone who caught his attention. Göth killed people the way you or I would swat a fly, recalled one survivor. Casually, without thought, without remorse. To him, Jewish lives meant nothing. We were insects to be eliminated. Oskar Schindler had to work with this man, had to socialize with him, drink with him, laugh at his jokes, present him with gifts. It must have been nauseating, but Schindler understood that Göth controlled access to the Jewish workers, and maintaining good relations with the camp commandant was essential to saving lives. The two men were a study in contrasts. Göth was cruel, sadistic, a true believer in Nazi ideology who genuinely hated Jews and enjoyed their suffering. Schindler was pragmatic, motivated by conscience rather than ideology, charming where Göth was brutal. Yet they found common ground in their shared love of excess, drinking, women, luxury goods. Schindler played a dangerous game. He would visit Göth's villa bringing expensive cognac and black market delicacies. They would drink together and Schindler would subtly work to moderate Göth's worst impulses, to create openings where he could request favors, to establish himself as someone Göth saw as an ally rather than an obstacle. Herr Schindler could charm anyone, recalled Helen Hirsch, Göth's Jewish maid whom Schindler later saved. Even a man as terrible as Göth Schindler would tell stories, make jokes, offer gifts, and somehow convince Göth to agree to things that saved lives. When Schindler wanted to establish the sub-camp at his factory, he presented it to Göth as a business arrangement that would benefit them both. The camp would be run by Göth's men, but Schindler would pay fees for each prisoner. Productivity would increase. Schindler would make more money, which meant more bribes for Göth, and Göth would get credit for running an efficient, productive camp. Göth agreed. In the fall of 1943, a barbed wire camp was constructed at Emalia with barracks for workers. Approximately 900 Jews, Schindler's workers and their families, were transferred from Plaszow to the sub-camp. They would still be prisoners, still guarded by SS men, still technically in Göth's custody. But they would be removed from the daily horrors of Plaszow, would be fed better, would be treated, relatively speaking, humanely. Moving to Schindler's camp was like moving from hell to something approaching normal life, remembered one worker. We still had to work hard. We were still prisoners, but we weren't being beaten randomly. We weren't watching people shot for sport. We had enough to eat. Schindler was saving our lives just by getting us away from Göth. But keeping people alive required constant effort and constant bribes. Schindler spent enormous sums maintaining his relationships with Nazi officials. Every time there was a selection at Plaszow where workers deemed unproductive would be sent to Auschwitz, Schindler would intervene to get his people removed from the transport lists. Every time officials questioned why his factory employed so many elderly workers or children, Schindler would produce explanations and bribes. He kept 2 sets of books, one showing legitimate expenses and profits for the authorities, another tracking his actual spending. The real numbers showed a man hemorrhaging money on bribes, on black market food to feed his workers better rations than regulations allowed, on medicine smuggled into the factory to treat sick workers, on payments to SS guards to look the other way when rules were bent. Schindler was spending every zloty he made and more on keeping people alive, Stern later testified. He could have been rich. The factory was profitable, but he poured everything back into protecting the workers. By 1944, he was essentially running a rescue operation disguised as a munitions factory. The disguise became more elaborate when, in 1944, Schindler converted his enamelware factory to produce artillery shells and other munitions. This made Emalia essential to the war effort in a way that cooking pots never could be, providing additional protection for his workers. Of course, the munitions produced at Emalia were often defective. Schindler and his workers deliberately sabotaged production, ensuring that shells wouldn't explode properly, that fuses were faulty. We made shells that would never kill anyone, one worker remembered with satisfaction. Schindler told us to be careful, to make it look good, but to make sure the weapons didn't work. It was our small way of fighting back. The game Schindler was playing became more dangerous as the war progressed. By 1944, Germany was losing. The Eastern Front was collapsing as the Soviet army advanced westward. Nazi officials became more paranoid, more willing to use violence against anyone suspected of undermining the war effort. Several German industrialists who had protected Jewish workers were arrested and executed for sabotage or treason. Schindler lived constantly with the possibility that he would be discovered, arrested, and executed as a traitor. Every bribe he paid, every defective shell his factory produced, every time he intervened to save a worker from deportation. All of these were capital offenses if discovered he was a Nazi party member, actively sabotaging the war effort and protecting the very people the regime was determined to exterminate. Why did he do it? One survivor asked years later. He risked everything. His life, his fortune, his freedom. For us. For people he barely knew, I still don't fully understand it. Perhaps Schindler himself didn't fully understand it. He was a complicated man, still drinking heavily, still carrying on affairs, still presenting himself as a loyal German businessman. But somewhere beneath that exterior, he had found within himself a capacity for extraordinary moral courage and compassion. The list. By the summer of 1944, the Soviet army was advancing rapidly toward Poland. The Nazis began evacuating concentration camps in the east, either killing prisoners or forcing them on death marches westward. Plaszow camp was slated for liquidation. Its prisoners would be sent to Auschwitz for extermination or to other camps where they would likely die from overwork, starvation, or disease. Schindler's workers faced annihilation. Unless he could do something, what Schindler did next was audacious even by his standards. He proposed to move his entire munitions factory, along with all his workers, to Brinnlitz in the Sudetenland near his hometown. He argued that Krakow was threatened by the Soviet advance, that continuing munitions production required relocating to safer territory, and that his skilled workers were essential to the war effort and must be transferred with the factory. The proposal required approvals from multiple Nazi agencies, all of which had to be bribed. Schindler needed permission from the SS, from the Wehrmacht, from economic ministries, from local authorities in both Krakow and Brinnlitz. Each layer of bureaucracy represented another opportunity for the plan to fail, another official who might ask inconvenient questions, another bribe that had to be paid. But the heart of the scheme was simpler and more profound. Schindler needed to compile a list of workers designated as essential for the factory's relocation. Everyone on the list would be transferred to Brinnlitz. Everyone not on the list would go to Auschwitz. The list would be a list of life. Schindler worked with Itzhak Stern and other Jewish associates, including Mitek Pemper, a prisoner who worked as a clerk in Göth's office and had access to camp records. Together they compiled names, not just skilled workers but families, children, the elderly, people who had no business being on a list of essential munitions workers but who deserved to live. We put down everyone we could, Stern recalled. We included children by falsifying their ages, claiming they were older than they were and capable of working. We included elderly people by claiming they had specialized skills. We included disabled people by describing them as essential supervisors. It was all fabrication, but it was fabrication that saved lives. The final list included approximately 1,100 names, 800 men and 300 women. Stern typed it on an old typewriter, multiple copies, each name carefully recorded years later. That list would become famous simply as Schindler's List, a roster of lives saved from the Holocaust. But putting names on paper was only the first step. Schindler still had to actually move these people, had to convince the Nazis to transfer over 1,000 Jews. When official policy was to murder them, the bribes required were astronomical. Schindler later estimated he spent 4 million Reichsmarks, essentially his entire fortune, on the Brinnlitz operation. In October 1944, the transfer began. The men on Schindler's list were loaded into cattle cars and sent west. Schindler traveled with them, using his authority as a munitions producer to ensure they reached Brinnlitz rather than being diverted to a death camp. The women faced a more terrifying journey. Their train was mistakenly routed to Auschwitz-Birkenitz. 300 Jewish women, supposedly protected by being on Schindler's List, found themselves in the most infamous death camp in history, where millions had been murdered. When Schindler learned his female workers were in Auschwitz, he was frantic. He traveled there immediately and spent days negotiating with camp officials, bribing, threatening, calling in every favor he had. He needed to extract these women from Auschwitz, a place people entered but rarely left alive. It was impossible, one official told him. These women are already processed. They're scheduled for work assignments here. The paperwork has been filed. Schindler didn't accept impossible. He paid enormous bribes, brought in bottles of liquor and jewelry, forged documents claiming the women were desperately needed for arms production, and somehow, through a combination of bribery, deception, and sheer force of personality, got all 300 women released and transferred to Brinnlitz. When we saw Herr Schindler at Auschwitz, we thought we were hallucinating, remembered one of the women. We were sure we were going to die there. Then Schindler appeared arguing with the guards, and within days we were on a train out. It was a miracle. By November 1944, all of Schindler's Jews were at Brinnlitz, housed in a new camp attached to a factory that Schindler had set up in an old textile mill. The facility was supposed to produce artillery shells, but in reality, it produced almost nothing of military value. We made sure nothing we produced actually worked, recalled one worker. Schindler ordered us to sabotage everything. He'd buy shells on the black market to fulfill his quotas rather than actually producing them. The factory was a facade. Its only real purpose was keeping us alive. The haven at Brinnlitz. The factory at Brinnlitz was unlike any other concentration camp in the Nazi system. Officially, it was a sub-camp operated under standard SS procedures. Prisoners were supposed to work long hours producing munitions, to be fed minimal rations, to be subject to strict discipline and punishment. In reality, Schindler ran Brinnlitz as a refuge. Workers were fed better than regulations required. Schindler bought food on the black market and used his connections to secure additional rations. A hospital was set up to treat sick workers, with medicine smuggled in despite regulations forbidding medical care for Jewish prisoners. Children who should never have been allowed in a munitions factory were hidden when SS inspectors visited. Brinnlitz was an island, explained one survivor. Outside, Jews were being murdered by the millions. The war was ending in Germany's defeat, and the Nazis were killing Jews faster than ever, trying to complete the genocide before they lost. But in Brinnlitz, we were safe. Schindler had created this little world where normal rules didn't apply. Schindler's wife, Emily, played a crucial role at Brinnlitz, a role that history initially overlooked but that survivors later emphasized. Emily Schindler had endured her husband's infidelities for years, but at Brinnlitz she found purpose. She helped set up the hospital, nursed sick workers, and personally cared for Jews who arrived in terrible condition. In January 1945, a train car arrived at Brinnlitz carrying about 100 Jews who had been left to freeze to death at Goleschau concentration camp. The car had been sealed for days. When it was opened, bodies spilled out, frozen corpses and barely living people suffering from exposure, starvation, and disease. Most people would have turned them away, one survivor recalled. They were dying. They would bring disease. They were extra mouths to feed. But Emily Schindler insisted they be brought in. She personally nursed them, sat with them, fought to save every life she could. About a dozen survived because of her care. Oskar and Emily were an unlikely team. Their marriage was troubled. He was unfaithful. She was hurt and resentful. But at Brinnlitz, they worked together toward a common purpose. Oskar managed the bribes and the deception that kept Nazi authorities at bay. Emily managed the practical care that kept people alive, the feeding, the nursing, the daily work of maintaining the refuge they'd created. The SS guards assigned to Brinnlitz were carefully managed by Schindler. He got some drunk, bribed others, and carefully cultivated relationships that allowed him to bend or ignore rules. When guards threatened to enforce regulations strictly, Schindler would take them aside, offer expensive gifts, and explain that productivity and their own comfort would suffer if they made trouble. The guards at Brinnlitz were corrupt, which was our salvation, one worker remembered. Schindler kept them well supplied with liquor and black market goods. As long as they were comfortable and making money, they didn't care what actually happened in the factory. As 1945 progressed and Germany's defeat became inevitable, the danger increased. Nazi officials, knowing the war was lost, began destroying evidence of their crimes, including killing prisoners who might testify about what they had witnessed. Standing orders required that as Allied or Soviet forces approached, concentration camp prisoners were to be evacuated or executed rather than allowed to be liberated. Schindler received multiple orders to evacuate his workers or prepare them for transport to other camps. He ignored every order, forging responses that claimed technical difficulties, delayed timelines, or misunderstandings. He was playing for time, betting that the war would end before his deceptions were discovered. In April 1945, as the Soviet army approached from the east and the American army from the west, the situation became critical. Schindler received explicit orders to liquidate the camp and kill all prisoners. He refused. He gathered his workers and told them that if SS death squads came, he would defend the factory by force if necessary. "We were terrified," recalled one worker. "Any day, SS units could have arrived to kill us all." Schindler promised he wouldn't let that happen, but what could he really do against armed SS troops? "We lived in fear that our salvation would be snatched away at the last moment." But the SS troops never came. Germany was collapsing too quickly. Command structures were breaking down, and in the chaos, Brinnlitz was forgotten. Schindler continued his deception until the very end, forging documents, bribing officials, and creating the illusion that everything was proceeding according to regulations, when in fact he was protecting more than 1,100 Jews from extermination. The end and the beginning. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Schindler gathered his workers in the factory and gave a speech. He told them the war was finished, that they were free, and that the Soviet army would arrive soon. He also told them that he had to leave. As a Nazi Party member and German industrialist operating in what would become Soviet-occupied territory, he would be arrested and possibly executed if he remained. "I want to thank you for your work, for your cooperation, for your trust," Schindler said, his voice emotional. "You are free now. The nightmare is over. May you rebuild your lives and your families in peace." Itzhak Stern presented Schindler with a letter signed by all the workers, testifying to what he had done to save them and asking any authority who encountered him to treat him with compassion and help. Stern also gave Schindler a gold ring, made by a worker using gold from a tooth, engraved with a Talmudic verse, "Whoever saves one life saves the world entire." Schindler broke down in tears. "I could have done more," he said. "I could have saved more. I don't know why I didn't do more." "You did everything you could," Stern told him. "You saved us. Over 1,100 people are alive because of you." That night, Schindler and Emily fled west in a car, accompanied by several workers who wanted to help them reach the American lines. They traveled through chaos, a Germany in collapse with displaced persons, defeated soldiers, and refugees flooding the roads. Schindler reached the American zone and surrendered to U.S. forces, presenting the letter from his workers as proof that he had acted humanely during the war. The Americans investigated briefly, confirmed Schindler's story with the displaced persons camps where many survivors had gathered, and released him. He was not prosecuted for his Nazi Party membership or his industrial activities. But Schindler's post-war life was a long, painful decline. He tried to start businesses in Germany, but they all failed. He moved to Argentina in 1949 and attempted to run a farm, but that failed too. He returned to Germany in 1958, virtually penniless. The man who had spent a fortune saving lives now had nothing. After the war, Schindler was lost, observed one historian. He had defined himself through his rescue activities. When that mission ended, he didn't know who he was anymore. He drank heavily. His marriage to Emily finally ended, and he struggled with depression and purposelessness. The survivors he had saved didn't forget him. They sent him money regularly, small amounts from people who were themselves struggling to rebuild their lives, but who insisted on helping the man who had saved them. These payments, though modest, kept Schindler from complete destitution. In 1962, a delegation of survivors invited Schindler to Israel. He planted a tree at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial, and was celebrated by the people he had saved. It was a bittersweet moment, recognition for his heroism, but also a reminder of how far he had fallen from the wealthy industrialist he had once been. The Israeli government debated whether to grant Schindler the title Righteous Among the Nations, the highest honor Israel bestows on non-Jews who rescued Jews during the Holocaust. Some committee members were troubled by Schindler's Nazi Party membership and his early war profiteering. They questioned whether someone who had initially exploited Jews for profit could truly be called righteous. But the survivors were insistent. Oskar Schindler saved over 1,100 Jews at enormous personal risk and cost, they testified. Whatever his motivations at the beginning, whatever his personal flaws, he became a hero. He deserves recognition. After lengthy deliberation, Yad Vashem granted Schindler the title Righteous Among the Nations in 1962, though the formal ceremony was delayed in 1993 after the success of Steven Spielberg's film made Schindler's story world famous. The honor was officially extended to include Emily Schindler, recognizing her essential role in the rescue operation. Oskar Schindler died on October 9, 1974 in Hildesheim, Germany. He was 66 years old. In accordance with his wishes, he was buried in Jerusalem on Mount Zion in the Catholic cemetery, the only former Nazi Party member buried in Israel. His grave is marked with a simple inscription: the unforgettable lifesaver of 1,200 persecuted Jews. To this day, survivors and their descendants visit Schindler's grave, placing stones on it according to Jewish tradition, a tradition of remembrance, of gratitude, of acknowledging the man who had saved their families. The complex legacy. Understanding Oskar Schindler requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. He was a war profiteer who initially exploited Jewish labor for personal gain. He was also a man who underwent a moral transformation and ultimately spent his entire fortune and risked his life saving over 1,100 people from genocide. He was unfaithful to his wife, a heavy drinker, someone who lived beyond his means and made poor personal decisions. He was also capable of extraordinary courage, compassion, and self-sacrifice when confronted with evil. Schindler was not a saint, emphasized one survivor. He was a flawed human being. But that's what makes his story so important. He shows that you don't have to be perfect to do extraordinary good. You don't have to be a hero your whole life to become one when it matters most. The transformation of Oskar Schindler from opportunist to rescuer raises profound questions about human nature and moral capacity. What causes someone to change so dramatically? How do we explain the fact that a man capable of infidelity and profiteering was also capable of risking everything to save strangers? I think Schindler discovered something within himself that he didn't know was there, reflected Itzhak Stern. When he witnessed the ghetto liquidation, when he saw the full horror of what the Nazis were doing, something broke inside him. He couldn't pretend anymore that these were just business transactions involving abstract workers. He saw human beings being murdered, and he found he couldn't accept it. Psychologists and historians have studied Schindler's transformation for decades. Some see it as gradual, stern, and others slowly awakening his conscience over months and years. Others see it as sudden, the shock of March 13, 1943, shattering his moral complacency. The truth is probably some combination, a gradual awakening accelerated by acute trauma. What Schindler shows us is that moral courage can emerge from unexpected places, observed one Holocaust scholar. We like to think that in extreme situations the heroes would be obvious, the priests, the teachers, the ethical leaders. But sometimes the heroes are gamblers and drinkers and profiteers who find within themselves reserves of humanity they didn't know they possessed. The story of Oskar Schindler also complicates our understanding of good and evil during the Holocaust. It would be simpler if all Nazis were monsters and all rescuers were saints. But reality is messier. Some Nazi party members like Schindler saved lives. Some ordinary people in occupied countries collaborated with evil. The dividing line between good and evil runs through every human heart, not between groups or categories. Schindler forces us to confront the fact that being a Nazi party member didn't automatically make someone irredeemable, noted one historian, and conversely, not being a Nazi didn't automatically make someone good. What mattered was what people chose to do when confronted with the reality of genocide. Schindler chose to resist, to save lives, to put himself at risk. That's what defines his legacy. The power of one. One of the most important lessons of Schindler's story is what one person working alone can accomplish even in the midst of systematic evil. Schindler had no army, no political power, no authority. What he had was determination, resourcefulness, and a willingness to use every tool available, bribery, deception, manipulation, charm, to save lives. People often ask, "What could I have done during the Holocaust?" reflected one educator who teaches Schindler's story. They assume the answer is nothing, that ordinary individuals were powerless against the Nazi state. But Schindler proves that's not true. He was one man who saved over 1,100 people. If more people had acted like him, hundreds of thousands more might have survived. Of course, Schindler had certain advantages. He was German, a party member, someone with connections and resources. A Polish or Jewish person couldn't have done what he did. But within those constraints, Schindler maximized his impact. He used his privileges not for personal gain, though he could have become very wealthy, but to save lives. The Schindler-Juden, Schindler's Jews, became a community after the war. They held reunions, stayed in contact, and supported each other. Many settled in Israel, others in the United States, still others remained in Europe. They married, had children, built lives and families that would never have existed without Schindler's intervention. Researchers have estimated that by 2015, approximately 8,500 people were alive as descendants of Schindler's Jews. Children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the people he saved. That's 8,500 lives that exist because one man decided to do the right thing in the midst of history's greatest evil. "When I look at my children and grandchildren," said one survivor in her 90s, "I think about the fact that they're only here because Oskar Schindler saved me every birthday, every wedding, every graduation. These are gifts that Schindler gave to us. He gave us the gift of life and the gift of future generations." The impact of Schindler's actions extended beyond just the people he saved. His story inspired others who learned about it, demonstrating that resistance was possible, that not all Germans accepted Nazi ideology. and that individual moral courage could make a difference even in the darkest times. The film and the memory. For decades, Oskar Schindler's story was known primarily to the people he saved and to Holocaust scholars. Then in 1982, Australian novelist Thomas Keneally published Schindler's Ark, released as Schindler's List in the United States, a historical novel based on extensive interviews with survivors. The book won the Booker Prize and brought Schindler's story to a wider audience. But it was Steven Spielberg's 1993 film Schindler's List that made Oskar Schindler a household name and brought Holocaust education to millions of people worldwide. The film, shot in black and white with documentary-style cinematography, depicted Schindler's transformation from profiteer to rescuer with emotional power and historical grounding. The film took some dramatic liberties. Certain events were compressed or simplified for narrative clarity, some characters were composites, and the iconic image of the girl in the red coat, the only color in the black and white film, was a symbolic rather than literal representation. But survivors and historians generally praise the film for its emotional truth and its success in conveying both the horror of the Holocaust and the possibility of moral courage within it. The film wasn't perfect history, noted one scholar, but it accomplished something remarkable. It made millions of people care about the Holocaust and about Oskar Schindler's story. Students who might never have read a history book about the Holocaust watched the film and learned about genocide, about resistance, about moral complexity. That educational impact is invaluable. The film's release in 1993 coincided with renewed attention to Schindler's legacy. Yad Vashem formally extended the Righteous Among the Nations honor to Emily Schindler, acknowledging her essential role that had been somewhat overlooked in earlier accounts. Memorials were established at the sites of Schindler's factories in Krakow and Brinnlitz. Educational programs used Schindler's story to teach about the Holocaust and about the moral choices individuals faced during that period. Some critics argued that the focus on Schindler, a German rescuer, distracted from the experiences of Jewish victims and survivors. They worried that the narrative of the good German might be used to minimize German collective responsibility for the Holocaust. These were fair concerns, and educators have worked to ensure that Schindler's story is taught in proper context, as an exceptional case, not a representative one. Oskar Schindler saved 1,100 Jews, one Holocaust educator emphasizes to students. That's extraordinary and deserves to be celebrated, but we must also remember that 6 million Jews were murdered, that most Germans either participated in or acquiesced to genocide, and that Schindler was a rare exception rather than the norm. His heroism stands out precisely because it was so unusual. The enduring questions. The story of Oskar Schindler leaves us with profound questions that remain relevant decades after his death. What creates a rescuer? What enables someone to resist when so many others comply or collaborate? How do we evaluate someone whose life contains both profound moral courage and significant personal failings? "I've studied rescuers for decades," said one psychologist who specializes in Holocaust research, "and I still can't give you a formula for what creates someone like Schindler." It's not religion. Schindler was a lapsed Catholic who rarely attended church. It's not political ideology. He was a Nazi Party member. It's not inherent morality. His personal life was marked by dishonesty and infidelity. Yet when confronted with genocide, he responded with extraordinary courage and compassion. Research on rescuers during the Holocaust has identified some common characteristics: empathy, the ability to take risks, a sense of personal responsibility for others, and often a certain rebelliousness or refusal to conform to authority. Schindler possessed all of these traits, though they manifested in complicated ways. The question of why more people didn't act like Schindler is painful but important. Thousands of German industrialists employed Jewish workers during the war. Most treated them as disposable slave labor, working them to death and replacing them when they died. A few, like Schindler, chose to protect their workers. What separated these groups? Fear was a factor, one historian explains. The Nazis executed Germans who helped Jews, but fear alone doesn't explain it. Schindler was afraid too, but he acted anyway. I think the real difference was moral imagination, the ability to see Jewish workers as individual human beings rather than as abstract units of labor. Once you saw them as people, it became harder to accept their murder. Schindler's story also raises questions about redemption. Can someone who began by exploiting suffering be redeemed through later actions? Most survivors answer emphatically yes. They argue that Schindler's transformation demonstrates the capacity for human growth and change, that past mistakes don't prevent future heroism. Judge people by their best moments, not their worst, one survivor told his children. Schindler's best moments saved my life and the lives of over 1,100 others. That's what I choose to remember. The weight of memory. As the last survivors of Schindler's List age and pass away, the responsibility for maintaining Schindler's memory shifts to descendants and to historians. The generation that experienced the Holocaust firsthand is nearly gone. Soon the story will be preserved only in documents, recordings, and the memories passed down through families. The descendants of Schindler's Jews have formed organizations to ensure their parents' and grandparents' stories are not forgotten. They visit schools, give talks, maintain memorials, and work to keep Holocaust education robust. They see themselves as custodians of a history that becomes more important, not less, as time passes. My grandmother was on Schindler's List, said one descendant. She told me stories about Oskar and Emily Schindler, about life in the factory, about the fear and the hope. It's my responsibility now to tell those stories, to make sure people understand what happened and what it meant. The sites associated with Schindler's rescue operations have become pilgrimage destinations. Schindler's factory in Krakow is now a museum chronicling both his rescue operations and the broader history of Nazi occupation of Krakow. Thousands of visitors walk through the spaces where Schindler's Jews worked, where they were sheltered, where lives were saved. At Brinnlitz, memorials mark the site where Schindler's final refuge operated. The factory buildings still stand, now adapted to other uses, but marked with plaques commemorating what happened there. Visitors can see where over 1,100 people survived the final months of the war, while millions of others were being murdered, and in Jerusalem, Schindler's grave remains a site of remembrance. The Catholic cemetery on Mount Zion is an unlikely location for one of the most visited graves in Israel, but visitors come constantly. Survivors, descendants, tourists, students. They place stones on the grave according to Jewish tradition. They leave notes of thanks. They stand in silence remembering a complicated man who did extraordinary good. Every time I visit Schindler's grave, I think about the fact that I'm only alive to be standing there because of him, reflected one elderly survivor. My children are only here because of him. My grandchildren and great-grandchildren exist because one man decided to spend his fortune and risk his life to save people he barely knew. That's not something you can ever fully repay or fully express gratitude for. The final accounting. This has been WW2 Stories. I'm Philip Champion. As we remember Oskar Schindler, we must resist the temptation to make him simpler than he was. He was not a saint. He was a gambler, a drinker, an adulterer, a war profiteer who initially saw Jews as exploitable labor. But he was also capable of extraordinary moral courage, of transformation, of spending everything he had and risking his life to save others. Schindler's story reminds us that heroism can emerge from unexpected places, that moral transformation is possible even in the midst of systematic evil, and that individual actions matter even when confronting systems that seem overwhelming. He proved that one person, armed with determination and resourcefulness, could stand against genocide and win. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to save more than 1,000 lives. The 1,100 Jews Schindler saved were not abstract numbers. They were individuals with names, families, stories, dreams. They were Itzhak Stern, the accountant who became Schindler's moral compass. They were Helen Hirsch, Amon Göth's terrified maid whom Schindler rescued. They were the children whose ages were falsified on the list, the elderly whose skills were invented, the families who stayed together because Schindler insisted on keeping them united. Each person represented a world saved, and through them thousands of descendants who would never have been born. Schindler's transformation, from Nazi Party member exploiting Jewish labor to rescuer spending his fortune to save Jewish lives, demonstrates both the worst and best of human nature. It shows that people can change, that confronting evil can awaken dormant conscience, and that past mistakes don't prevent future heroism. His story complicates our understanding of the Holocaust by showing that not all Germans were willing perpetrators, just as it complicates our understanding of heroism by showing that heroes can be deeply flawed human beings. Perhaps most importantly, Schindler's story is a reminder of what each of us might be capable of if confronted with extreme evil. Most of us will never face anything like the Holocaust, but we all face moral choices about whether to help others, whether to resist injustice, whether to spend our resources on ourselves or on others in need. Schindler chose ultimately to spend everything he had, his fortune, his safety, his comfort, to save lives. His choice redeemed a life that had begun in moral mediocrity and transformed him into someone whose name is honored worldwide. The Talmudic verse engraved on the ring Schindler's workers gave him captures the essence of his legacy. Whoever saves one life saves the world entire. Schindler saved over 1,100 worlds, 1,100 universes of experience, memory, love, and potential. Through those saved lives, he created thousands more, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren who exist because one man found within himself the courage to do the right thing in the midst of history's darkest hour. Oskar Schindler died alone and poor, estranged from his wife, struggling with alcoholism and depression. But he died knowing that over 1,100 people were alive because of him, that families existed because of him, that he had made a difference when it mattered most. His grave in Jerusalem, covered with stones left by grateful survivors and their descendants, stands as a testament to the impact one person can have when they choose courage over comfort, sacrifice over selfishness, life over death. As the last survivors pass away and their stories fade into history, Schindler's legacy remains relevant. In every generation, people face choices about whether to help others at personal cost, whether to resist injustice even when it's dangerous, whether to see other people as fully human or as abstractions. Schindler's story reminds us that these choices matter, that individual actions can make a difference even against systems of evil, and that the capacity for extraordinary good exists within flawed, ordinary human beings, if we can find within ourselves the courage to act. May we remember Oskar Schindler, not as a saint, but as a complicated human being who, when confronted with genocide, found within himself the capacity for extraordinary courage and compassion. May we learn from his transformation that people can change, that past mistakes don't prevent future heroism, and that one person determined to do good can save worlds.